Welcome back on the show, Tracy Phillips. How are you today?
I am doing great, Anthony. Thank you for having me back. It's always nice to join you.
It's terrific to have you on, and you're always sharing such great insights. And the most recent insight I picked up was from the LinkedIn article you published on the 15th of June, and it was on chasing balance or supporting alignment, and so which is the focus. And I thought you wrote a brilliant piece on it, because what I find today with seeing my clients is that they feel overwhelmed and they're essentially seeking balance. And I thought you provided some profound insight in that article, which I'd love you to share with the listeners today. So maybe we'll start out with a little bit about you for those that haven't listened to the previous episodes, and then we'll get into talking about the topic.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you always following, what I'm writing. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to kind of then branch into conversation about it. But for your listeners, a little bit about me is my background pre the coaching that I do now, which is executive leadership and performance coaching, is I actually have a background in holistic health. So I was a holistic health coach for a number of years before I kind of launched into where I am now. But so I work with C-suite and entrepreneurial visionaries and help support them to understand what it is to be a visionary in a leadership position, and to designate, discover, and kind of define that placement for themselves. What does that mean for them, and how, once we establish that concept of lane and where their value is greatest for their organization, how they can stay within that lane so that they're not constantly, being pulled out into other things, and that they can bring that value forward as best they can, while at the same time making sure and positioning themselves to be supported by, the right people who can help them execute their vision. So that's really the majority of the work I do these days. But health and wellness and well-being has always been close to my heart, and continues to be even in my personal life.
Fantastic. And I was just thinking, when you were just talking then about working with C-suite executives, is that they would be encountering this topic that we're about to discuss, just simply with workers sort of, I guess, unwillingness or not wanting to change again and go back into the office, and because they've found some sort of balance with working from home. And so I'm thinking that it probably applies well to your clients in terms of these discussions about, there's an element of encouraging workers to get back in to help with that collaboratory and that creativity aspect of work. But the workers have found this, maybe their sweet spot, or maybe not. What are you finding, Tracy, in terms of your field of work?
Yeah. So it's interesting, because we are in a time where, this concept of what works best for me is really on the table, front and center. As you just pointed out, with a lot of the employees, what works best for them is this concept of, work at home, at least, the hybrid, at least part of the time for some, who have determined that, no, they actually want to work remotely. That's what works best for them. Organizations and those who run them have to look at what's best for the organization. And so that is at this point looking very different from person to person, which is why I believe we also see, a lot of challenge in getting people, like you said, back into work, but just back into certain positions that require them to be, in person, restaurant work. I mean, you see this in all sorts of different industries where, really it's not even feasible for them to work remotely. And so as those companies and organizations and businesses start to open back up, and as they have, try to roll back out, it's been a challenge. But, really this idea of alignment and how it struck first a chord of, me deciding to sit down and write an article about it, was that I started to notice, because I think I've mentioned to you before, I don't know if I've mentioned at any point in any of our discussions online, but I listen for trends. So I'm always listening for patterns that I hear, coming up, because for me that starts to show itself as, directions in which we're going, but also very important lessons that we're learning collectively, right? Kind of as a collective human family. Because that's part of the work that I do, is helping, people to to not only in their own leadership, but also to navigate the current environment in which they are needing to lead. And so they can better understand it's not just me, but it is kind of a collective force type of thing. And that they're not just working with, in their own silos. This is something that could globally be going on, that I pay a lot of attention to those things. And one of the pieces that I started to hear this word alignment, I mean, we all know what alignment means, but I'd never heard it spoken so much, and words are a very curious thing for me, and I pay a lot of attention to language. And so, as I'm seeing more and more people use this word, I started to kind of ponder that, but really look more closely. And where we used to use more of this concept of work-life balance as a main focus, what I was hearing people talk about more and more, and I have been hearing people talk about, is finding the right alignment for them, right? Being aligned in their own choices, being aligned in their own lives, being in relationships where they felt aligned. You also hear people talking a lot more using the word resonance, things that resonate with them. And so really what I extracted from that and looking at this idea of, well, what does balance mean? What does alignment mean? And this curious shift from talking about balance to one that's more of alignment, what does that mean? And, as I broke it apart in the article, if we look at literal definition, balance is a lot about, finding the space of homeostasis, finding, this kind of point within two, not always extremes, but two polar different points, that where we can find some sort of ease or point of where things can work, according to how we need them to work, and comfort. Whereas the idea of alignment is more of a measurement to who we are, where we are, what we want, and whether that thing is aligned, right? So it, again, is this like, is this supportive? Is this going to help me? Right. As opposed to, is this a place of comfort and homeostasis? And really, when we look at the idea of balance, I mean, balance can be achieved in very brief increments, right? We never see, even in the human body, everything is always in flux, right? Everything is always changing and shifting at any one moment. And so this idea of perfect balance for anything longer than a couple of seconds, is kind of that illusionary thing. And so what I started to think about is, so if that's the case, always seeking balance is something we're constantly chasing, right? We can never quite attain it. And that to me is like, what do we need to be doing in order to be, balanced? And because we can never really be balanced for more than a couple seconds in reality, then we're always chasing. Right. And that concept of how much energy it takes. I mean, I know that most of my clients originally came to me when I was doing holistic health work, and I need, better balance in my diet. I need better balance in, my work life type of thing, which I still get to this day. But is it so much about chasing that illusionary balance, or is it more about this concept of making choices that are aligned to how we've already chosen to be? Right. So my point in the article is, balance is more about what we need to do. So we're constantly chasing and trying to do the right thing to get that golden nugget, or that, that prize at the end of the rainbow that is balance. Or are we actually looking to make choices that are more aligned to a placement of being, right? A way of being, a lifestyle, work that fulfills us. Is this choice, is this environment, is this person, is this whatever, helping me attain that more or less? And that then will tell me that there is more or less aligned with that concept of vision that I want for myself. So it's not so much about chasing as it's about discerning. And that's a very different point of reference from which to make decisions, right? We're trying to chase something down. We're reliant upon catching that thing to be happy, to feel fulfilled, to feel like we've gotten that thing we want. Whereas alignment is more about, this is where I want to be, and these choices of action or direction or whatnot, I get to discern and determine whether those are in alignment with me being able to be that particular way.
And is that where you think the workers are at with their thinking generally speaking, in terms of, is going back into the office aligned to my values, what's important to me? Because they've been given a good taste, like 2 years at least, of being able to spend more time with family, to be able to, not commute, and hence have that time back to them and be able to exercise or go for that cup of coffee with a friend or something like that. So are they now struggling with, well, if I go back into the office, that will disappear, I'm losing something. And the gain of going back into the office is for the employer. It's not really, I feel that I can do my job at home. Is this the sort of conversation, and is this a piece on that alignment and people questioning whether it's aligned to them?
Yeah, I believe so. Obviously everybody's situation is different, but, for me, based on the conversations I've been having and just looking out into the world, I think that's one of the reasons for the Great Resignation. People making the choice to leave their positions because that is no longer what they want to be doing, whether that position was in an environment that just didn't suit them. It wasn't aligned, right, to how they wanted to be treated or how they wanted to spend their time, or whether it was more of, okay, now everybody is expected to be back at the office and I like working remotely. I want to find a position where I can continue to do that. And nothing, no shade on my current job. I like the environment, but I just would rather be at home. There's many reasons why people have chosen to leave the jobs that they were in. But, I think in general, this idea that we finally got a taste of what it's like to choose how we want to live our lives. I think everything that's been happening over the course of the last, 2+ years, almost 3 now, it really has made us take more radical responsibility for our choices. And I think in a nutshell, that's really what's unfolding. Whether you look at, any of the occurrences and big shocking events that have transpired, it really all boils down to, if we zoom out of the storyline and we really look at what it's offering, it's asking us to take radical responsibility for our choices. And so, where we can become, where we're less dependent upon systems, people are saying, I don't really need that job that badly, apparently, right? If they're able to leave it, that's what they're saying. And yet I think we're also still in a time where when, the child leaves the home and says, no, I want to be an independent adult, they still haven't had the experience of being an independent adult. They have the concept that they like, but they haven't yet, rented their own place and paid their own bills. And so when the reality of that sets in, then there's that, kind of need to figure it out. And I think that's the time we're in kind of collectively, is that we're demanding more freedom. But then, as I said to you off air, we love the concept of freedom and being able to do things that are in alignment with how we feel we want to be living. But we also have to pay the price of that. In other words, taking radical responsibility means that we may have to be making choices and doing things differently and in a sovereign place and not reliant on these systems or these people or these things we used to be getting a paycheck from in the course, in the case of jobs, in order to have that freedom. Right. And so, everybody's up in arms when things change suddenly. But let's really look at what that is establishing. And is that the whole story? If we zoom out and we look, that's just one perspective. But if we look at everything, what is this all offering us as an opportunity to take radical responsibility for our lives, to make choices differently, to be more intentional, to look at what does make me happy, what is in alignment in my life. It isn't just about balance anymore, because before COVID, where we were just kind of going along with what we'd always done, it may have been more like, how can I know things are off kilter, but how can I find more balance? Now that we've taken a step back and we've kind of had a different experience, this idea of, I'm the creator of my life. I get to choose how this life unfolds. Now let me be a little bit more selective and aware of the choices I'm making, because they have an impact, in the experience that I have, that I call life. And so people, I think, are just learning, first of all, that that's available, which is why this idea of alignment, or this word, keeps coming up more and more. But I think also too, on the other side of that, we're in it. We're, some people are in it not aware, they're thrashing about, not realizing yet that this is a transitional time, and we are gaining more sovereignty in a lot of ways, but it comes with a cost. It comes with a price, which means we have to be able to stand up for and uphold that sovereignty, and again, take responsibility probably for things we've never had to and never taken responsibility for before.
Yeah, so very true. The more I think about, what you're saying and what we've been through, is there was a period there where there's a lot of out of people's control, and they've been told what to do. You have to work from home. You can't go outside. You can only shop, at this certain time. You have to wear a mask, and all these imposed restrictions. And I'm thinking that created a big void in terms of, them feeling the lack of control. Now the control has, that it's more opened up now. The economy's, more open. There's less restrictions, and they're getting that sense of control back. And they've got, they're really wanting that, so that, because there's a stronger desire because of the void that was created during the pandemic. So is there a bit of that is going on as well now? Is that people feel that, well, I have more say. I had this, yeah.
Well, I feel that we've always had less control than we thought we did. Again, pre-COVID, that's just the way it was. You'd hear a lot of people like, that's just the way it is. You want a job here? This is just the way it is. You want to work for this company? This is our culture. This is how we do things. And nobody questioned that. What happened with COVID is it just basically put even more emphasis on that control, because it was so concentrated. There was so much more of it, that it there was the straw that broke the camel, that kind of opened up this awareness of, oh my gosh, I'm being controlled by, my culture, my society, my job, my boss, my, fill in the blank. It never even occurred to me that I have a choice. Now that we've been able to step back, what quarantine did is, yes, it forced us, controlled us to do certain things. But what it also did is it gave us some downtime to really reflect. And in that reflection, a lot of people started to come to this realization that it's not balance that I'm chasing. I shouldn't have to try to grab my piece of happiness amongst all this control that's been placed upon me and my conditioning. Is it really that I do have my locus of control is within, and that I really can make choices that align with the life I want to live. And that's where we start to see it, because language is always a reflective mechanism, right? I always tell people, your language doesn't lie. So when you tell me something, I can hear your truth, right? Even when people say, oh, no, that's not what I meant. Yes, it is. You may not want to admit that that's what you meant, but if you said it, there is absolute truth in it. And sometimes that can be shocking even to us, that we're using certain language. And then when that's pointed out, it's like, whoa, I didn't even realize that's how I felt, or that's where I was, in my beliefs. But I think that's the key piece, is that when I start to hear shifts in words being used that weren't being used before, it shows me where people are in their development at that point. And when I see it collectively, it's where we all are, because more and more people are saying this. And so, for me, it's really about a deep dive into what is the language kind of mirroring about our internal shifts and changes that have been affected by the external shifts and changes that have been going on over the last couple of years. It isn't just about the last couple of years. What the last couple of years have done is it's illuminated what's been going on for a very long time. And now what we're seeing on the other side is kind of, I call it the Oz moment, in the Wizard of Oz, where Toto pulls, the curtain back and exposes Oz for who he truly is. He's not the great green globe in the sky that everybody thought was God. He's actually this scared little man behind a curtain. And that's what's happening right now, is that, that pressure that we went through over the last couple of years has now created this space where a lot of stuff is being illuminated. Now, this stuff didn't just appear. It's like, somebody doesn't just become an overnight success. They've been working 30, 40 years to get to that point. It's just all of a sudden they hit, the prime space in their career, and they're seen, and they're, and everybody sees this talent, but that's been developing for quite some time. It's the same thing here. These crazy truths that are coming, it's been going on since the beginning of time in some regards. And yet the shock and awe has to do with the fact that we've been so kind of distracted by all of our conditioning and our busyness that we haven't seen it. And now we're seeing it and we're like, what? And is this in alignment with what I want from my experience? No, now I have to take responsibility for what I do with this information. Do I want to project it back and push it back into the world and say, and victimize, put myself in the victim role and say, you world perpetrated me and you need to fix it. That's what a lot of people are doing. This isn't right. You need to fix it. This is, hey, it is what it is. And I think this is where it's really hard, because a lot of people are realizing they have to take radical responsibility for their health. They can't just run to the doctor for another pill, because that's not working anymore. They have to take radical responsibility for their words and actions, because people are just not tolerating bad behavior anymore the way they did before, maybe because nobody wanted to rock the boat. I mean, I could go on, but that's really what's happening. And that's a good thing. It's an uncomfortable time, right? But it's again, we talked about this before, breakdown to breakthrough, right? A lot of things have to come apart before we finally realize that the thing that we've been searching for change the most is staring right back at us in the mirror, right? It starts here and it starts within. And we have to shift. If we want to see a different experience, if we want to be more aligned, we have to make more aligned decisions.
I was just thinking about you'd be in high demand at the moment with helping these executives align, I guess, try to find some sort of alignment between where the company's values are and where the person's values are. And I guess everyone has a unique set of values, and trying to help bridge that gap, which appears to be quite great at the moment. And hence employers are really struggling with that alignment piece and the great resignation as a result of that. And are you finding that? Are you finding the C-suite executives are in this sort of bit of despair of saying, well, we're all over the place. We're not aligned. What do I do?
Well, what's happening is, obviously, as you can imagine, all of this going on outside is affecting, the workforce and how quickly they resign when they don't like something, which I don't disagree with. But I think that at the same time, it takes both. It takes an inward look on both the parts of the employee and the employer. The employee, it's like, okay, am I just having a tizzy because I didn't like the way I was spoken to, and am I trying to do anything about that, or am I just walking out the door? Is this something that has been going on for quite some time and I'm finally speaking up to it? And it's making it more uncomfortable? Well, that's different than a situation where I just don't like how I'm being treated because I'm not getting things the way I want them. So again, we kind of have to look at this, and this is what I talk about with my clients, is that, the changes in your workforce are going to illuminate whether you have a healthy culture or not. Because in some regards, you start to make the internal change. What I've seen a lot with my clients, which is interesting, is they are willing to step up and make the healthy changes within. They're tightening their belts and getting better aligned with the needs of their people, and just getting to know their people better, and how that feels on the front lines, as opposed to just where they sit on top. But as they're willing to do that work, and yet in order to have things continue to run effectively, they need to put certain things in place. That's also putting pressure on their workforce. They're like, but that's not how it used to be. I used to be able to just wander in at 9 a.m. and nobody would call me on it. And now all of a sudden I have to clock in, and, everybody's being held more accountable. Some people are voting themselves off that island because they liked the flexibility of not being told that they were coming in late, but they wanted more, maybe of the other things, benefits or who knows what. It's a give and take. And I think, I do see in a lot of spaces, a lot of demanding without coming to the table wanting solution, right? It's your job to fix it for me kind of attitude. I've seen this on both sides, both the employer, they just need to get over it and, come back to work. Shouldn't have to be more empathetic. They need to just do their job, that kind of attitude. But I've also seen it on the other side, where it's like all of these things that, employers are supposed to be doing for people in order to make them feel, like they're like king or queen of the jungle, kind of thing. Like I need to be, the royal red carpet has to be rolled out for me. And all these things need to be in place for me to feel comfortable and safe in this, again, I'm using, extreme examples, but I'm seeing them. And so I think that both sides need to stop pointing the finger out. Both sides get to start looking in and saying, okay, what can I do to be a part of the solution that I seek, right? The employers seek a certain solution. Guess what? Their solution or what they're really seeking is no different than what the employees are seeking at the end of the day, right? And I think when we can get them in the same room to have these crucial conversations, because they're not easy in the beginning, but if we set some parameters and no finger pointing and no blame and no shame, and we speak from the I position, my experience has been, I don't know what other people's perspectives are, but my perspective is this. I humbly speak to my individual perspective. We speak like that and take responsibility for our own perspective. We can start to really illuminate a lot of these gaps and let each side see what the other one isn't seeing. We can start to work on, bridging those gaps and coming together and creating an organization that's going to be good for everyone. And so, but it's going to take less of the infighting and the, either the strong arming, which just like I see some, clients who just want to double down, fine, we'll just find other people. I'm like, well, good luck with that. I mean, not that you won't find other people, but when your attrition stays at 40%, then, the new people don't like it either. There's something like, what's the common denominator here? So I think the sooner people stop resisting the change and start to work with it and realize they need to be a part of the solution and they need to make some radical changes and take radical responsibility for what they may not even be aware of at this point, then we're going to start to see less persistence of the same thing continuing to happen. Because again, what we resist persists. And so, we have to drop the resistance and we have to be willing to kind of humbly come to the table and say, okay, all right, clearly there's some probably uncomfortable things we need to look at and we need to address and we need to talk about and we need to get real about. But let's do that because what we want to do is get past that into a better place.
And just on the aspect of alignment, because we did that episode on connecting the three brains, our brain or the mental brain, and then the heart brain and the gut brain. And, we did talk about that alignment between the three. And, I was thinking as a result of having that alignment with your mental brain, your heart brain and your gut brain, how well health goes for you in terms of, everything works well in synchronicity and, your microbiome is good, your gut is happy and your cardiovascular health is good and your mental health is good when you're operating from this point of alignment. So I think it'd be good just to touch on that because we've been discussing a lot on alignment and aligning of values and how we have this disconnection between employer and employee. Just from that personal point of view, is how good it is for our health to have that alignment and how people can stay in alignment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think when it comes to, this is oftentimes when I'm, teaching my clients how to work with that, three brain model, I call it the leadership intelligence model because, our decisions are made by the information that we absorb, right? So we make decisions based on the information we have. But if we're only allowing ourselves to, engage with, the information that comes through our head brain, for example, and we're leaving out our heart and gut brain information, then we're going to be making decisions based on a third of the available information at best. And so really one of the things I teach them is, when you're going into a scenario where you need to make a decision, ask yourself, what am I seeing and thinking about this, right? What do I automatically see in the storyline that pops out at me? What's the information I can gather through my head brain based on what I'm thinking about this? Because thinking always comes from those conditioned values around things, what we've experienced before, what we've been told. And so, that we can gain a certain amount of information there. But I also have them ask questions, and what am I feeling about this? Am I feeling someone else's? Because we are very empathetic by nature. I mean, some people have trained themselves to be more so. But, as human beings, we have empathy. When people say, oh, you need to teach me to have empathy. I'm like, well, you have empathy. You may just have pushed it aside a little bit. And you need to reconnect with it. But what are you feeling from the other people? Right? How do you feel they are, or what are you feeling about this scenario? Let's start to dig in and not just look at the value of the emotions, but what the emotions are telling us, because they're just vehicles, or they're messengers, right? So anger is a messenger. Fear is not really an emotion, but fear is usually masking. Anger is masking fear. Disgust, is a messenger. Confusion is a messenger. We have all of these different feelings, and they're messengers. And when we can start to extract what the messenger is really telling us, we have then the vital information. And then also the gut is, what do I sense? What are you sensing? Are you sensing that this is a priority? Don't think about it. Just tell me yes or no. Is this a priority? Yes, I think. No, yes. Right? Like, great. Let's dig into that. Your gut is telling you this is a priority. You may not want to deal with it. Your head's telling you, because that's where the ego is residing. Like, well, I don't know. Maybe it's not. We don't want to touch that snake, but that it's a priority. So let's go with that. Teaching leaders how to establish, and literally access and understand that information so that they're making better decisions is vital. So, a lot of the exercises I do is we take a scenario that they're dealing with, and usually the high level decision making. And then, it's like, well, let's test that theory. If you're feeling that your people are feeling this way, if you think you're tapping into their feelings, let's do a questionnaire. Let's send out a survey and let's get some feedback and find out if that's what they're feeling. And now we have a potential for a discussion. And you can, and then as these leaders start to trust that what they're picking up information wise is actually true, because as we start to learn more about this and we have track record, behind us, like, oh, I did this exercise last time and I found out that what I was feeling, they were feeling was really what they were feeling. I do that a number of times and I can start to trust these emotions and how they can lead me in the right direction to get vital information that I need to work with. So, and I think when it comes to health, it gets us reconnected with ourselves. I think we have been so historically disconnected from our bodies, yet they're the vehicle that gives us life. And so to really start to get back into these brains and working with them and asking them and trying to, dissect and discern and, and translate what they're telling us to use in our actual decision-making process gets us realigned, because, the feeling body or the gut body actually is the physical body. Right. So sometimes when people are like, I don't know what I sense, I'm like, well, are you sensing anything in your body? Well, yeah, my ears are ringing, or I have this funny feeling in my toes. What is that all about? They're coming back into their body, because we're asking that sense, perception question. And when people start to get less distracted and focus in on, okay, now I'm looking at and I'm really focusing on my body and what it's telling me, they're surprised at what it's telling them. So it's grounding people back in their body, which is really good for our health. It's always best when we are with our body and not someplace else. And so that's a huge step in the right direction. And the more people do that, the more they become more aligned and aware, of what their body's doing at any one time.
Yeah, and then they can obviously take the appropriate action. If they're constantly, getting this emotion, well, then, they can then look at what's driving it, what's behind it. Is it the way I perceive things, or, is it a paradigm that I need to shift or whatever? And that sensing you mentioned is so important, because I hear a lot of digestive issues happening today, and it's connected to the brain, obviously. When they're stressed, digestion doesn't operate as well. So
and that's the gut brain. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, that's the gut brain. So usually when people are having digestive issues, I'm asking them if they're listening to their gut. Literally, yes, I can't. My stomach keeps growling. Okay, and that's the physical manifestation. But it's growling because it's trying to tell you, it's yelling at you at this point, right? Digestive disturbances have this way of if you're not listening, they're going to get louder and louder, just like any of the brains we don't listen to. They start to yell at us louder and louder.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so for the listeners, I'll include the link to Tracy's episode on connecting the three brains in the show notes, and also on the other episode that Tracy mentioned, which was breaking down to break through, because I know there's people feeling that they're at that point of breakdown, and we covered that in an episode previously with Tracy. So I'll include that in the show notes, and you can go directly to those two other episodes for a deeper dive into those conversations. Really enjoyed this conversation again today, Tracy. It was very insightful and very timely, I think, because in terms of where we're at around this transition back into the office, and how many days it is, and whether I want to go back in. So thank you for sharing your insight.
Oh, well, thank you, Anthony, for always inviting me to do so. It's always a pleasure to see you.
And do you have any concluding words for the listeners?
Well, I think that, your listeners are a savvy bunch. They obviously care about their health and well-being, and that's why they follow you and listen in on your shows. And I would say that, if anybody has any questions about any of the things that, I do come on and discuss, I'm always open for conversations and having people reach out and give feedback. That's something that I definitely think is important, because, when we're in our own space and we're kind of considering other people's perspectives and thoughts, that's a part of accessing, our response to information, is a truth about us that we get to access. So I would just say that however it lands, positive, negative, or somewhere in between, take that information, and, if I can help support that in any way, please reach out. But know that, there's something that's going on within us, whether it's the information you hear here or someplace else. That information and how it hits you is vital information. So really, figuring out how to unpack that and find out more about that, definitely take the time to do that, because, that's usually the nugget that we're looking for at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely, Tracy. And I thoroughly recommend to your listeners to follow Tracy on LinkedIn. So I'll include the link to Tracy on how to follow her. So you can go directly to following Tracy and read. I think Tracy's got around 77 articles published on LinkedIn, and every article is very insightful. So you'll get to see the latest trends and Tracy's insight on those trends, which is very educational and very important to stay up to date. So I thoroughly recommend you follow Tracy Phillips. And again, listeners, I really appreciate you tuning in to this episode of Me and My Health Up. And if you've really enjoyed the content, please share it with others that could also benefit from hearing this. So please get it out there to others that you think that could benefit. And stay tuned for more insightful episodes of Me and My Health Up. Thanks, Tracy.